As a follow-up to my top 3 piano practice tip videos I released recently, I thought it would be helpful and interesting to do a worked example of how to apply these tips to a piece end to end. Also, this particular piece, which is Henselt's Repos d'Amour, is perhaps better suited to a larger-handed pianist, yet with a little bit of imagination, it's more than manageable by those of us with much smaller hands. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hi, this is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists or indeed anyone who loves piano to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If it is your first trip here, please do think about subscribing. Simply hit the little icon in the bottom right hand corner of your screen now, and it's all done for you. My 3 top tips essentially form an approach to learning and practicing pieces, which is based on first splitting things down into more manageable building blocks that I nickname snippets, then finding ways of practicing each of these snippets effectively before we then start to recombine everything back into the finished article. Now, I've linked those 3 videos in the description below for you if you haven't seen them yet. However, today we're going to apply them to an amazing little piece I discovered thanks to Pianist Magazine. It's called Repose d'Amour by Henselt, and it features things such as splitting a melody between the hands and managing multiple melodies simultaneously. Now, in terms of the notes, for me, it feels that it's not massively difficult, yet it is certainly a challenge to make it sound as I want, which therefore makes it very rewarding to learn. My starting point, as described in my first top tip, is always to understand the structure of the music and then split it down into a number of sections. I then divide each of those sections into a number of segments, and then finally each segment into a number of snippets. These snippets are, if you like, the bite-sized chunks or building blocks, if you prefer, that I then use as my starting point for learning and practicing. Now, with this particular piece, it's only short. It's a total of 44 measures, but I think we can split it nicely into 3 distinct sections. If we take measures 1 to 16 as our first section, then measures 19 to 36 as the second, that leaves us with 37 to the end as the third section, or maybe a coda if you prefer. We can then split down the first section into a couple of segments. So from measures 1 to 8, and then another from measure 9 to 16. And then we can subdivide each of these further into snippets. And in this case, I use 2 measures at a time as my snippets. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through measure by measure how I've split it down, but I'll give you in the description below the entire breakdown that I did, and you can take a look at it later. If you then compare this breakdown that I've given to the score, you'll see that I always try to do it based on either musically or technically similar material. And this helps to keep practicing more cohesive, I've found. Let's take a moment to look at the melody here. As we can see in section 1, it starts off clearly written as if to be played by the left hand, with the right hand providing chords on the offbeat above it. However, if we look at the start of section 2, we can see now we have 2 melodies. The initial one, again written to be played with the left hand, and another one above it to be played by the right hand. So noting that we have these 2 melodic lines gives us a useful starting point for working on how to practice it. And that's because often I'd recommend starting with what is likely to be the most difficult part. However, in this case, I'd actually start from the beginning and let's get this first melody firmly embedded into our minds in its very simplest form. My first practice snippet here is measures 1 and 2, with the second being measures 3 and 4. However, if we look carefully at measures 5 to 8, where we've almost got the same material repeated, we can see on both occasions there's a bass note that we actually need to hold down. Yet at the same time, we need to frequently change the pedal to avoid blurring the melody in this register. My hands simply can't quite reach in a couple of places, which means that if I wish to hold down that bass note, I'm going to need to use my right hand to take over the melody where the left can't reach it. So, given I'll be doing this in measures 5 to 8, in measures 1 to 4, where the melody is the same, I'll adopt exactly the same fingering strategy. As I discussed in my second top tips video, I like to find different ways of practicing the same thing, whether that be slowly, whether it be with rhythms or staccato or whatever. I call these different ways of practicing things practice variants, and how I define them really depends on the music. Often, a good starting point is to work out a simplified variant, which is the approach I took here. So my first step when practicing this, therefore, was to work on just the bass and the melody, omitting the chords. Of course, we need to work out our fingering carefully first, nice and slowly, so that when we are practicing without the chords, we're going to be using the same fingering we intend to use in the finished version. I work snippet by snippet, as of course we need to differentiate between where we hold the bass note and where we release it. Once this is nicely under our fingers, we can add in the chords. Again, we'll work on each snippet separately, taking our time to properly notice the tiny little differences between the two. The right hand chords change from one to another, you might notice. This then is our second practice variant. As this particular passage isn't tremendously difficult, I found that these two variants were more than sufficient. Then, once we're happy we can comfortably control the phrasing of each of these snippets in isolation, we'll practice them together as our first finished segment. And I discussed this idea in more detail in my third top tip video, but in short, it's about starting to recombine a piece progressively from its very smallest building blocks into progressively larger ones. We can take the second segment in the same way. Again, we're going to be splitting it into snippets, and I chose to take, again, 2 measures at a time. And we can practice first just the bass and the melody, as we'll again divide it between the hands. So our first practice variant is that. We can then explore dynamics and phrasing, of course, while we have less notes to think about. Next, we add back the chords. However, in this case, I found it useful to do this in 2 stages. First, adding back just some of them, and that gave me a second practice variant, and I'd do this until it felt good. And then finally, add back the remainder, and that gives us a third variant for this particular part, which is a little more complicated than the first section. I find it helps to lay very firm foundations so that when we add back the extra notes, we don't start to become overwhelmed by them, as can so easily happen. So let's stick with the same technique here. Once we're happy with individual snippets, we start adding them together. First 2 at a time, then 3 at a time, before eventually playing the entire segment. Now, as a power tip, I found that it can be really helpful to actually start our practice from our simplest variant as we start each day. So even if yesterday we were practicing it as written, when we first start practicing today, let's start back from just the bass and the melody, for example. Now, let's take a look at the second section. This is much more involved, as we have a second melody being added as well now. To make things even more of a brain twister, we're still going to split the initial melody between the hands, so the right hand now has 3 distinct jobs to do. First, it has to voice its own melody. Secondly, it has to play the accompaniment. And thirdly, it has to help the left hand with the original melody. However, there are also a couple of places where we can let the left hand help the right hand with some of the other chords. So in this time, the left hand also has more than one job to do at a time. And this is where splitting things into component parts for our practice variants becomes even more helpful. So to practice this, let's first take a snippet of measures 19 to 22. As a first practice variant, let's practice just the upper melody and the bass. As a second, let's practice just the lower melody and the bass. As a third, we can practice both melodies and the bass together. And then finally, as our fourth, we can add in the chords. However, note that I have also chosen to split those chords between my left and right hands, taking the lower note with the left hand, the upper note with the right hand. And by doing this, I find that I don't need to have my left hand jumping around. We can practice our next snippet, measures 23 to 26, in a similar manner. Again, the benefit of splitting into snippets like this is that the right hand melody changes very subtly, as does the left hand one. And then practicing them separately like this for a few minutes at a time helps us really learn these differences properly. The next two snippets can be practiced in exactly the same way. However, for those of us with smaller hands, we do have an important decision to make in measures 32 and 34. As you can see, the lower melody has a D natural played against an upper melody note of an E, which is 9 notes above it. And there's an A in the bass. Now my hands will just about reach a ninth, so I can conceivably take both melody notes with my right hand. My left hand can't reach from an A to a D, so the only option I have if I don't want to use my right hand would be to roll them if I want to use my left hand. Now I opted to go for the stretch. However, the downside to this is that it's more difficult to actually voice both notes, and rolling the left hand is a perfectly workable solution. In some ways, perhaps it's even more reliable unless we find the stretch comfortable. In the final snippet of this section, measures 35 to 36, we have another couple of places where we can choose to split the chord accompaniment between the hands. Again, I find it more comfortable to do it this way. For the final section, it's pretty much rinse and repeat, to be honest. Again, think carefully about how you might wish to share the notes between the hands. Remember, it doesn't matter which staff the notes are written on, it's a case of which gives the best control. So for example, in measure 42, you might opt to take the chords with the right hand rather than the left, as the score seems to suggest. Finally, for the choices I made, the only place I actually opt to roll a chord is measure 37, as I simply can't reach a tenth. Let me know how you get on with this lovely piece, and if you find the sections, segments and snippets approach helpful. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit the little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I do thank you very much for watching and look forward to seeing you very soon.